The untouchable reign. The galaxy trembled under the rule of Princess Zareth, a being so powerful that no one dared to challenge her authority. Her empire spanned across countless planets, each one bowing to her will. She was untouchable, a symbol of absolute control, and her reign had lasted for centuries. Her guards, loyal beyond measure, stood watch at every corner, ensuring that not a single soul could defy her. On her home planet, the people lived in fear. The streets were quiet, almost too quiet. Citizens went about their days, heads down, trying not to catch the eye of the princess's enforcers. Anyone who spoke against her was swiftly silenced, and no one ever spoke out. Princess Zareth was a goddess in their eyes, her power unmatched. She controlled not just their planet, but their very lives. Even the mightiest warriors feared her, and no one had ever come close to defeating her or her guards. Zareth lived in a magnificent palace, towering above the city below. The palace was a fortress of beauty and danger. Its walls were made of shimmering, unbreakable material, and its halls were lined with statues of her likeness, symbols of her strength and her dominance. Inside, Zareth ruled with an iron fist, her mind sharp and calculating. She was not just a warrior. She was a master manipulator, able to bend others to her will without lifting a finger. Her guards, highly trained and fiercely loyal, were the only ones allowed near her. They were always by her side, ready to protect her from any threat, real or imagined. Each of them had pledged their lives to her service, and they would die before letting anyone harm her. They were the best of the best, handpicked by Zareth herself. With their unmatched skills, they had crushed rebellions before they even began, and their presence was enough to keep anyone from thinking of standing against the princess. But even in this world of complete control, whispers began to spread. Whispers of a human, a single human, who was different from the rest. Unlike the others who bowed down to the princess's power, this human was bold, unafraid, and had something none of Zareth's subjects ever dared to have: courage. John Cooper was not a warrior by birth, nor did he have the strength of the alien soldiers Zareth commanded. But he was something even more dangerous to her, a soldier hardened by countless battles across different worlds. He had seen death in many forms, and it had only made him stronger. He had heard of Princess Zareth's cruelty, her unshakable reign, and he had made up his mind to end it. He would be the one to defy her, no matter the cost. John's arrival on Zareth's home planet was not by chance. He had studied her, learned everything there was to know about the princess and her empire. He knew that any attempt to directly attack her would end in failure, but he wasn't looking for a fight with her guards. He was looking for a way to challenge the princess herself, to show the people of her empire that someone, even a human, could defy her reign. The moment John landed on the planet, his presence was felt. Zareth's guards, ever watchful, noticed him immediately. They tried to dismiss him as just another fool who thought they could take down the princess, but there was something different about him. He wasn't like the others. His eyes held a fire that no one could ignore. The rumors that had spread about this human, his strength, his courage, were no longer just rumors. John was real, and he was here to make a stand. The princess, however, remained untouched. In her eyes, John was just another ant, insignificant in the grand scheme of her empire. She had crushed countless rebellions, and this one would be no different. Her guards would take care of him, just as they had done with the others. But Zareth underestimated the one thing that made John different: his resolve. As John moved through the planet's capital, the streets fell silent. The citizens who had long ago learned to keep their heads down watched in awe. Who was this man? Why wasn't he afraid? The princess's reign had been built on fear, but John seemed to be immune to it. He walked with purpose, his eyes fixed on the palace where Zareth sat in her throne, blissfully unaware that her empire was about to be shaken to its core. The first encounter with the princess's guards was swift and brutal. John had expected it. He had prepared for it. The guards attacked without hesitation, but John fought back with the skill and precision of a seasoned warrior. It wasn't just his physical strength that made him a threat, it was his mind. He knew how to outsmart his opponents, how to use the environment to his advantage, and how to stay one step ahead. He wasn't just fighting for survival, he was fighting for something much bigger, freedom. Despite their superior numbers and strength, the princess's guards struggled to contain John. He moved like a shadow, slipping through their defenses and knocking them down one by one. Word of the battle quickly spread, and the people of the planet began to take notice. For the first time in years, there was a glimmer of hope that Zareth's reign might not be as untouchable as it seemed. But Zareth was not a ruler who took threats lightly. She had made enemies before, and each time she had crushed them with ruthless efficiency. John's defiance would not go unanswered. She would see to it personally that no one dared to challenge her again. The princess summoned her most trusted warriors, the ones who had never failed her, to deal with this human threat once and for all. The game was on. John had made his move, and now it was time for the princess to decide just how far she was willing to go to maintain her unshakable control. Would she crush this human like all the others? Or would she face the reality that her reign might be coming to an end? The tension in the air was palpable. The princess's untouchable reign was no longer as certain as it had once seemed, and the fate of her empire now rested on the shoulders of one human who had the courage to defy her. The unexpected human arrival, Princess Zareth, had long been the ruler of the stars, her empire stretching across galaxies, untouched and unchallenged. Her reputation for cruelty and control was legendary, and anyone who dared to oppose her quickly learned the price of rebellion, an inevitable and painful end. But as the centuries passed, the fear that once fueled her reign began to fade into complacency. The princess believed that her power was absolute, and no one, not even a whisper of a challenge, could touch her. That is, until the unexpected arrival of one human, a soldier with a hidden agenda. John Cooper's ship emerged from the shadows of the galaxy, a small but determined vessel that cut through the blackness of space like a razor. He wasn't a hero, nor did he carry the weight of destiny on his shoulders. He was simply a soldier who had seen too much, a man who had lived through the worst of humanity's wars and survived. But it wasn't the wars of his past that brought him here, it was a personal vendetta, a deep need to put an end to the suffering caused by Zareth's oppressive rule. As his ship descended into the atmosphere of Zareth's homeworld, John felt a strange mix of anticipation and resolve. He had heard the rumors of a ruthless princess who ruled with terror, who used her guards as tools of destruction. Yet, there was something about her reign that irked him. There was something in the way her people cowered in fear that made him believe her empire wasn't as invincible as it seemed. With every step he took on this alien planet, John's heart beat faster. He was entering enemy territory, an outsider in a world where no one trusted him, no one would help him, but he was prepared. He had trained for this moment, studied Zareth's empire from every angle. He knew how her guards moved, how her palace was constructed, and how to slip past their watchful eyes. John wasn't looking for glory or fame. He was looking for a way to disrupt Zareth's reign. He didn't care that he was one man against an entire empire. He knew what was at stake. The people had been oppressed for too long, and he had made a promise to himself that he would be the one to challenge this untouchable princess. The moment John set foot on the planet's surface, Zareth's sensors detected his presence. Her vast network of surveillance swept over him, analyzing his every movement. But John was careful. He had come to this planet prepared for the traps and dangers that awaited him. He moved quietly, blending into the background of the city's winding streets. The citizens were no strangers to fear. They had learned to live in silence, to avoid drawing attention to themselves. They knew the cost of speaking out, the consequences of crossing the princess or her guards. As John walked through the streets, his presence felt like a spark in a room full of dry kindling. He was different from the others he walked with. Purpose, his eyes focused not on the ground, but on the palace looming in the distance. He didn't hide, he didn't bow his head. He held his ground, and it caught the attention of the citizens. Some stared, others whispered behind closed doors, but no one dared to approach him. No one dared to offer help. But inside their hearts, a small, quiet hope began to take root. Could this human actually bring an end to their suffering? It wasn't long before Zareth's guards began to notice him. At first, they were dismissive. They had dealt with many intruders before, most of them easily dealt with and discarded. But there was something unsettling about John, his confidence, his defiance. It wasn't like anything they had encountered. They weren't sure what to make of him, but they knew one thing for sure. He wasn't like the others. John knew that he couldn't remain unnoticed for long. The princess's guards were trained to be observant, quick, and merciless. His every movement was being watched, analyzed, and prepared for, but he didn't care. He wasn't here to blend into the shadows, he was here to challenge the very foundation of Zareth's empire. He wasn't just another rebel trying to overthrow a tyrant, he was a symbol. A symbol of the possibility that one person could stand up to the overwhelming might of an empire. And he would prove that even an untouchable ruler like Princess Zareth could be defied. The first encounter came sooner than he expected. A squad of guards surrounded him as he made his way through the heart of the city. They were quick, efficient, and ruthless. But John was ready. As the first guard lunged at him, he sidestepped with precision, knocking the guard out in a swift motion. The others moved in, but John's experience in battle shone through. He didn't fight like a warrior who relied on brute strength. Fought with intelligence, using his environment, his agility, and his speed. The battle was short, but brutal. John moved like lightning, taking down one guard after another. The streets that had once been silent now echoed with the sounds of combat. But despite the odds, John emerged victorious, standing tall amid the fallen guards. He knew that this small victory was just the beginning. Zareth would not take kindly to this intrusion, and the princess's wrath would soon be unleashed. As the smoke cleared and the people began to whisper about the human who had defeated the princess's guards, John knew that his mission had only just begun. The princess was untouchable, but he had made the first strike. The battle for her reign had begun, and one human had already shown that even the most powerful of rulers could be challenged. The princess's wrath, Princess Zareth, had ruled for centuries, and in all that time, no one had ever dared to challenge her. She had built her empire on the backs of the defeated, and her cruelty was as legendary as her power. No rebellion had ever stood a chance, no uprising ever threatened her throne. Zareth was invincible, until a lone human dared to defy her guards in the streets of her capital. At first, the princess couldn't believe the reports. How could this one human have defeated her elite warriors with such ease? Her first thought was to dismiss the incident as an anomaly, an accident. But as more news trickled in, whispers of the human's audacity spreading across the empire, Zareth's anger began to bubble to the surface. How dare he? The moment the last of her guards returned to the palace, beaten and bruised, Zareth's patience snapped. She had always maintained control through fear, through the power of her unmatched soldiers. The idea that one person could slip through her defenses, let alone defeat her elite guards, was unimaginable. She would not let this challenge go unanswered. Inside the grand halls of her palace, the princess summoned her war council. The leaders of her empire's vast military presence stood at attention, awaiting her command. But Zareth did not look to them for guidance. Her eyes were cold, calculating, filled with the kind of rage only a ruler who had never been touched by defeat could know. This human, she hissed, her voice like ice, has crossed a line I will make sure he regrets. Her council, Members exchanged uneasy glances. They had all heard of John Cooper, the human who had taken down Zareth's best warriors. To them, it was a trivial event, a small disturbance in the grand scheme of things. But to the princess, it was a threat to her very existence, a reminder that her power might not be as unbreakable as she had once believed. Zareth's fury was evident in her every move. Her guards had returned, their pride shattered, but it wasn't their failure that angered her most. It was the fact that someone had the nerve to challenge her rule. She had always been the one in control, the one feared across galaxies, the one who had crushed rebellions before they could even begin. And now there was a human who dared to defy her, and not just with words, but with action. "Bring him to me," she ordered, her voice low and commanding. "I want him alive." But Zareth wasn't just going to deal with him herself. The human's arrogance needed to be broken in a way that sent a message across the Empire. Her guards would be there, yes, but this time, she was going to make sure it wasn't just the guards who dealt with the human. She would make an example of him, something that would instill terror in anyone who even thought about challenging her again. The princess turned to her most trusted enforcer, Commander Viker, a hulking alien warrior known for his brutal tactics and relentless pursuit of those who dared to defy the crown. "Viker," she commanded, "take a squad of my best and bring him to me. Do whatever it takes." Viker nodded, his eyes filled with the promise of violence. He was the most loyal of her guards, the one who would follow any order without question. If anyone could hunt down this human, it was him. Zareth knew that he would make sure the human would never be a threat again. As the commander and his squad departed, Zareth stood alone in her chamber, her hands clenched into fists. She had been a ruler of untold power, and no one had ever dared to defy her for so long. The challenge of this human felt different, raw, personal. It was no longer just about crushing an enemy. It was about reclaiming her reputation, her dominance. The Empire needed to see that she was still the ruler they feared, still the untouchable force that had governed them for so long. Meanwhile, John Cooper didn't know the storm he was about to face. He had made his move, and now the princess would come for him. He had wanted to show the people that they weren't powerless, that they didn't have to live in fear. But in doing so, he had made a target of himself. The tension in the air was thick as John prepared for what he knew was coming. He had expected retaliation, but he hadn't expected the princess herself to come after him. Zareth was not a ruler who fought with honor. She fought with everything at her disposal. And now, John was about to face her wrath in a way he never imagined. As the princess's forces closed in on him, John realized the true magnitude of what he had done. He wasn't just fighting a corrupt ruler, he was fighting an empire that would stop at nothing to keep its grip on power. But one thing kept him going, the belief that even the most untouchable rulers could be brought down. The first confrontation, John Cooper had never imagined that the first true confrontation with Princess Zareth would come so soon. But when her forces descended on him, swift and merciless, he knew the time for subtlety had passed. Zareth wasn't content to wait any longer. Her guards had failed her, and now she was sending everything she had to crush him. But John was ready, having anticipated this moment since the day he set foot on her planet, that it was no longer just about a battle between one human and a princess. It was about the future of a galaxy, the future of people who had lived under the boot of an untouchable ruler for too long. The stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. And yet, in the face of it all, John stood firm, unwavering in his resolve. He had come too far to turn back now. Zareth had never known a challenge like this. Her palace, the heart of her empire, was filled with the whispers of her guards, murmuring among themselves as they watched the human advance. No one had ever defied her in such a way. No one had ever dared to enter her domain with the intention of taking her down. She had expected a swift capture, a quick execution. But John's presence was a spark, something that threatened to ignite everything around him. And so, She finally gave the order. John was to be brought to her, alive or dead, it didn't matter. But Zareth wasn't just going to wait for the human to come to her. She would meet him face to face, let him see the full weight of her power. It was the only way to send a message that no one, not even a human, could defy the princess without consequences. The scene was set in the heart of her palace. The grand hallways, once a symbol of her control, now felt like a battlefield. Zareth stood at the top of the staircase, her gaze cold and calculating. The walls were lined with guards, but they were no longer the ones who would decide this battle. It would be her and John, face to face, each determined to see the other fall. As John stepped into the grand hall, he felt a wave of tension crash over him. The air was thick with the promise of violence, and the princess's presence was like a weight pressing down on his chest. She stood there, regal and untouchable as always, her gaze piercing as it met his. Her guards flanked her, but they stayed back, watching the confrontation unfold with a strange sense of anticipation. Zareth's lips curled into a sly smile, a smile that spoke of years of dominance and unchallenged power. "So the human thinks he can take down a ruler like me?" she said, her voice smooth and filled with malice. "You should have stayed in the shadows, little human. You're in my world now." John's eyes never left hers. He could feel the weight of her words, but he wasn't afraid. He had come this far not just for himself, but for everyone who had been silenced under her rule. "I'm not here to hide, princess," he said, his voice calm but steady. "I'm here to end your reign." The words hung in the air like a challenge that no one had ever dared to issue before. Zareth's smile faded, and in its place, a look of cold fury replaced it. No one spoke to her like that. No one defied her like that. It was an insult, and she would not stand for it. Without a word, Zareth raised her hand, signaling her guards to move in. But before they could act, John was already in motion. He moved with speed and precision, a soldier honed in battle, his instincts sharp. As the first of her guards lunged at him, John sidestepped and struck with brutal efficiency, taking the guard down in a flash. His movements were fluid, a perfect blend of strategy and raw talent. He wasn't just fighting for his life, he was fighting for something greater. Zareth's eyes widened in shock. She had expected him to be skilled, but not like this. He was more than just a man, he was a symbol of defiance, a force that refused to be broken. As more guards came at him, John fought back with everything he had. Each move was calculated, each strike designed to incapacitate rather than kill. He wasn't here to slaughter Zareth's guards. He was here to show her that her empire could be challenged. Zareth watched from above, her fury building. This human, this insignificant creature, was making a fool of her guards, and it enraged her. She had spent her life building an empire that was supposed to be untouchable, and now one man was threatening to tear it all down. Her pride could not bear it. With a wave of her hand, she ordered her personal enforcers into the fray. These were no ordinary soldiers. They were the best, trained for one purpose only: to eliminate threats to the princess's power. They were larger, stronger, and faster than the regular guards. They had been handpicked by Zareth herself, but even they couldn't stop John. One by one, they fell to his skill and determination. His eyes never wavered, his movements relentless. For every guard Zareth sent, John had an answer. His body was bruised, his energy running low, but his resolve was stronger than ever. This was his fight, his moment to show the universe that even the most untouchable ruler could be brought down. Finally, Zareth could stand it no longer. Her fury boiled over as she descended the staircase, her eyes locked on John. "You think you can take me down?" she hissed, her voice venomous. "I am the untouchable. I am the goddess of this galaxy." John stood firm, his chest heaving with exhaustion, but his will unbroken. "You're not untouchable anymore, princess. No one is." The final confrontation was inevitable, and as the two faced off, the tension in the room was palpable. It was no longer just about power, it was about something much deeper: freedom, defiance, and the price of standing up to tyranny. Breaking the chains, the battle inside the princess's palace had shifted from a mere clash of strength to something much more profound. Zareth, once the undisputed ruler of the galaxy, found herself facing the undeniable truth. Her reign was not as unshakable as she had believed. John Cooper, the human who had defied her and her empire, had become more than just an intruder. He was a symbol, a living embodiment of resistance that her guards, her warriors, and even her own empire could not ignore. But Zareth wasn't one to easily accept defeat. She had always been the one who controlled the narrative, who bent others to her will, and she would not let this human tear that down. Her pride, her power, and her empire were at stake. And in her mind, there was only one way to end this. As the human warrior continued to cut down her guards and push deeper into the heart of her palace, Zareth realized that brute strength alone would not be enough to stop him. She had underestimated the power of his resolve, and it had cost her dearly. The image of her flawless reign was beginning to crack, and she could feel it. But Zareth was no ordinary ruler. She was a master strategist, and she had learned long ago that the battlefield was not only fought with weapons, it was fought with the mind, with alliances, and with the will to crush any challenge before it could rise. In a flash of clarity, she decided to change tactics. The physical confrontation would not defeat John. It was time to break him mentally. She turned to her elite commanders, her voice cold and commanding. Bring him to the lower chambers. Let him see the true cost of his defiance. With a signal, her personal guard surrounded John, and before he could react, they bound him, holding him in place as they dragged him through the dimly lit corridors of the palace. The tension in the air was thick, and John's heart pounded in his chest. He had known there would be no easy way out of this. Zareth was not one to surrender, but John refused to show fear. He had come this far, and there was no turning back. Now his mind raced, calculating his next move, but he knew that this was different. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for the people who had lived under Zareth's oppressive rule for too long. The ones who had never known freedom. They were depending on him. As they reached the lower chambers, John was thrown into a cold, dark room. The air was heavy with the smell of damp stone and a sense of hopelessness. He knew what was coming. The princess would try to break him. She would try to make him understand that one person could never topple an empire, that defiance would only lead to destruction. But John's spirit was unyielding. He had seen too much to be cowed by fear. Zareth appeared in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of the palace's dim lights. She stepped into the room, her presence as overwhelming as ever, her eyes locked onto his, filled with disdain. She didn't need to say a word, her expression spoke volumes. "You are nothing," her gaze seemed to say. "You will break, just like all the others. I've crushed entire civilizations." "Human," Zareth said coldly, her voice echoing in the silence of the chamber. "What makes you think you stand a chance? You, one man, against a galaxy I have already conquered. The moment you set foot here, you sealed your fate." John's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening with determination. "Maybe I'm just the first to stand up to you," he replied, his voice steady, though his body ached from the earlier battle. "But I won't be the last." Zareth's lips curled into a wicked smile. "Brave words," she said, stepping closer, her voice like ice. "Let's see how brave you are when you witness the destruction you've caused." Without a word, she snapped her fingers, and the room filled with a sharp hum. A small, dim screen flickered to life on the far wall. On it appeared images of people, innocent people, living in squalor under her rule. They were shackled, enslaved, their faces gaunt with hunger and fear. Their eyes met John's through the screen, and in them, he saw not just suffering, but desperation. These were the people he had come to save, the ones who had quietly endured. Zareth's reign for so long. Zareth's voice cut through the silence. You think your actions will bring freedom? You think you can save these people? She gestured to the screen. They are my empire, and I will not allow you to tear them apart. They belong to me. John's chest tightened as he watched the faces of those he had vowed to help. But the sight only fueled his resolve. These people had been suffering in silence for too long. Their pain had ignited something in him, a fire he couldn't ignore. He wasn't just fighting for a cause now. He was fighting for their freedom. You're wrong, John said, his voice rising. They don't belong to you. They belong to themselves. Zareth's expression darkened. You think you can change their fate? You think they would ever rise up against me? You are a fool, human. She stepped back, her eyes flicking toward the guard standing at the door. Take him to the arena. Let him see the consequences of challenging me. The princess's words stung, but they didn't break him. In that moment, John realized that the true battle wasn't just about strength, it was about heart. The heart of the people who had been silenced. The heart of the human who dared to stand against tyranny. And his heart, unwavering in the face of impossible odds, was the greatest weapon he had got. As the guards dragged him toward the arena, John knew one thing for certain. He had broken the chains of fear, and the princess's reign was finally showing. The first cracks. The battle was far from over, but the flame of rebellion had been lit. The final battle, the weight of the galaxy seemed to rest on John Cooper's shoulders as he stood in the center of the arena, surrounded by the imposing walls of Zareth's palace. The cold stone structure towered around him, its oppressive silence amplifying the tension that had built up over the past days. The moment he had known was coming, the moment when everything would be decided, had finally arrived. The princess would stop at nothing to protect her empire, and John had become the ultimate symbol of defiance. But John wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He wasn't just fighting for a cause, he was fighting for the future. The arena was vast, a coliseum of sorts, filled with thousands of the princess's loyal subjects, their eyes fixed on the spectacle before them. They watched in silence, knowing that this moment would either crush their hopes or ignite a new beginning. Zareth, standing in her royal box above the arena, gazed down at John with a mixture of disdain and cold curiosity. She had seen countless warriors enter this arena, all with the same goal to challenge her authority and fall. Yet John was different. He had already defied her once, and now she would ensure that he was brought to his knees. The air was thick with anticipation. Zareth's loyal guards, now armed with heavy weapons and gear, began to move into position around the arena's perimeter. These were no ordinary soldiers. They were the best of the best, each trained to eliminate threats with brutal efficiency. There was no escape, no second chance. This was the final showdown, and Zareth was determined to make sure it was the last. 1. John's eyes scanned the arena, taking in the situation. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, but his focus was on one thing: surviving. He had come too far to falter now. He was alone, with only his skill, will, and heart to guide him. And in that moment, he realized that it wasn't the weapons or the numbers that would determine the outcome of this battle. It was the fight within. As the guards closed in on him, John's mind raced. His body was bruised, tired, but his spirit burned brighter than ever. He had faced overwhelming odds before. He had fought in wars, battles, and impossible situations. But none had felt quite like this. His enemy was not just the princesses guards, it was an entire system built on fear and oppression. He wasn't just battling for his life. He was battling to break that system. The first guard lunged at him, a massive armored figure, his sword raised high. John sidestepped with precision, striking the guard's weak spot with a fluid motion. The guard crumpled to the ground, his weapon falling uselessly from his grasp. But there was no time to celebrate the small victory. More guards rushed in, their weapons drawn, their expressions filled with cold resolve. They had been trained to deal with threats like John. They had been trained to end rebellions before they could even start. The clash was deafening, a chaotic symphony of steel against steel. John fought with everything he had left. Every punch, every strike was a reminder of why he had come here, to prove that even the most untouchable rulers could be brought down. He moved like a shadow, his body weaving through the guards with deadly grace. His skill and speed were unmatched, but even he could feel the strain. He wasn't invincible, he was just a man, fighting against an empire. Zareth watched the battle from above, her eyes narrowing with both frustration and admiration. This human was unlike any adversary she had faced. He was relentless, resourceful, and unyielding. She had underestimated him, and now he was forcing her to face the reality that her empire might not be as unbreakable as she had believed. But Zareth wasn't going to let him win. Not now. Not when everything she had worked for was at stake. With a gesture, she summoned her final weapon, the Enforcer, a towering figure clad in an exoskeleton of reinforced armor. The Enforcer was Zareth's personal creation, a combat unit designed to overpower any foe, no matter how skilled. It was fast, powerful, and relentless, and its sole purpose was to hunt down and destroy threats to the princess's reign. As the massive figure entered the arena, the ground shook beneath its feet. Its glowing red eyes fixed on John. The crowd fell silent. This was it, the ultimate challenge. John had faced her guards, but now he would face the Enforcer. The fight would no longer be about skill alone. It would be about survival. Zareth's voice rang out through the arena. Finish him. The Enforcer charged, its massive fist swinging toward John. He barely managed to dodge in time, feeling the wind of the punch as it whizzed past him. His heart raced. He had to think fast. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for everything. He wasn't just battling for himself. He was battling for the people he had come to save. The Enforcer came at him again, its movements almost too fast for John to track. But he was no stranger to impossible odds. He ducked, using the Enforcer's momentum against it, pushing it off balance for just a moment. John didn't waste the opportunity. He struck, hitting the Enforcer's vulnerable joints with precise, calculated blows. But it wasn't enough. The Enforcer roared in fury, its armor shaking off the hits as though they were nothing. John's exhaustion was starting to show, his movements growing slower, his breath heavier. The Enforcer, however, was just getting started. As the Enforcer lunged for him again, John had a realization. This wasn't just a battle of strength, it was a battle of wills. He had to outsmart this machine, find a way to break its momentum. His mind worked quickly, analyzing every weak point, every flaw in the Enforcer's design. Then, in a moment of clarity, he saw a small, exposed gap in the back of the Enforcer's armor. John moved in a blur, taking a leap that only years of experience could have allowed. He landed behind the Enforcer, using his full force to drive his blade into the exposed weak spot. The Enforcer let out a deafening roar as sparks flew from the damaged armor, but John didn't stop. He kept pressing, kept pushing until the machine finally gave way. With one final mighty blow, the Enforcer crumpled to the ground. The arena was silent once more. The crowd had witnessed a miracle. A human, against all odds, had taken down the princess's deadliest weapon. Zareth stood motionless in her box, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had lost, but the battle wasn't over yet. The true fight, the fight for the future, was just beginning. Anew dawned. The dust of the arena still hung in the air, thick and heavy, as the wreckage of Zareth's Enforcer lay in a heap on the ground. The crowd, once silent and afraid, had begun to murmur. They had witnessed something that would go down in history. A human, one man, had dared to defy the might of an empire, and he had triumphed. The princess's once invincible reign had been shattered in an instant. And yet, as John Cooper stood amidst the chaos, breathing heavily, his eyes locked on the princess herself, he knew the fight was far from over. Zareth, standing at the edge of her royal box, was no longer the proud, untouchable ruler she had once been. Her eyes were wide with disbelief, her knuckles white as she gripped the railing in front of her. She had been so certain of her power, so confident in her control, that the thought of one human breaking her empire seemed almost laughable. But now the impossible had happened. The crowd, once fearful and obedient, had begun to stir, their eyes no longer filled with fear, but with something else. Hope, the very thing Zareth had worked so tirelessly to suppress. They looked at John, this human who had toppled her might, and for the first time in years, they began to whisper, to dare to dream of a life beyond her rule. John's chest heaved with exhaustion, his body battered and bruised, but his resolve was unbroken. He had fought for this moment, for the chance to bring an end to the suffering that had gripped this galaxy for far too long. The people had been oppressed, silenced by the iron fist of Zareth's empire, but now they saw something they hadn't seen in centuries, a glimmer of freedom. With every step he took toward the base of the royal box, his mind raced. Zareth might be defeated, but the remnants of her empire still lay in wait. Her guards, her loyal followers, would not easily accept her fall from power. He knew that her defeat would only mark the beginning of a new kind of battle won for the future, for a future where people were no longer slaves to fear. John reached the center of the arena, and his voice echoed through the once silent halls. "This is not the end, princess." His words were steady, his eyes never leaving hers. "Your empire was built on lies and oppression, but it doesn't have to end in bloodshed. The people of this galaxy deserve better than this. They deserve freedom." The princess's eyes narrowed, her pride still refusing to crumble completely. She was a ruler, and no ruler, no matter how defeated, would allow themselves to be completely humiliated. "You think you've won, human?" Zareth spat, her voice cold with venom. "You've broken my guards, you've broken my enforcer, but you'll never break my people." John shook his head, his gaze soft but resolute. ***, you were never their ruler, Zareth. You were their tyrant." He turned toward the crowd, his voice now carrying the weight of everything he had fought for. "But now it's time for them to choose their own fate." For the first time in years, a spark of rebellion burned within the hearts of those watching. The people had been waiting for someone to show them that they didn't have to live in fear, that they could fight back against tyranny. John had given them that hope. He had shown them the truth. Zareth's guards, those who had once served her without question, began to stir. There was a tension in the air, unsettling, palpable. The loyalty that had bound them to Zareth was crumbling, just as the walls of her empire had begun to fall. They looked to John, uncertain, torn between the loyalty they had pledged to her and the freedom they now saw before them. The princess, realizing her empire was slipping away, took a step forward, her voice a low growl of defiance. "You may have won today, but I will not be forgotten." John's eyes remained steady, his stance firm. "You will be remembered, but not for the reasons you think." With those words, the battle was over. Zareth's guards, now unsure of their path, began to lower their weapons. The air was filled with tension as the princess, once so powerful, was left standing alone, stripped of her empire and her power. The people of the planet who had lived in the shadow of Zareth's reign for so long slowly began to rise. They looked at John with reverence, their faces filled with awe. They had witnessed the unthinkable, the fall of the untouchable princess. And they knew, deep in their hearts, that the time had come to rebuild. John Cooper had done what no one had thought possible. He had taken on the might of an empire, and against all odds, he had won. But in the end, his victory wasn't just over Zareth, it was over the tyranny and fear that had plagued the galaxy for centuries. As the crowd surged forward, their voices rising in unison, John looked up at the sky, feeling the weight of the moment settle into his chest. This was just the beginning. The dawn of a new era had begun.